When I first started working, I had, I had a boyfriend who was, how old was I, 17? And I think he was about 33. Would be very frowned on these days, but everybody was terribly jealous. So we used to go out dancing to jazz clubs and so on. He had a motorbike. It was really cool. It was a Norton. I can't remember, Norton 500 or something. Or was it 750? I don't know. Or that was the Triumph, the 750, wasn't it? Anyway, yeah. And so we used to go on the pillion. And before they opened the first motorway, which was the M1, uh, before it was opened, but after it had been completed, no other traffic on it, we went on a section of that motorway when we shouldn't have been on it. I was on the pillion and we did 140 miles an hour down the motorway. And no, we didn't have crash helmets or anything. It was really, really dangerous and mad. But it was great fun. But I wouldn't want to do it now because I'm afraid I'm boringly sensible now, but I wasn't then.
This is my grandfather, Peter Dawson. He liked golf, American culture, and he liked cars too. I think I got that from him. I remember going to visit quite frequently, and sometimes he'd be out on the street at the front of the house working on the car. And of course I'd be out there trying to help, but more likely getting in the way. I remember him teaching me about them, pressing the throttle for him and the brake, and learning all about this new technology, electronic fuel injection. We went on holiday together quite a lot, usually Mablethorpe or Skegness, and if there was any attraction with 4 wheels and a steering wheel, of course I would want to go. He would always oblige. He took me golfing with his friends once, and I remember driving down the country roads around Louth, seeing him heel and toe, using all of the rev range, driving with such precision. I was in awe. Of course he made me promise never to tell my nan how he drove, in fear she might have a heart attack. He inspired me to seek out a career as a driver, and I would love to hear his voice, just one more time telling me how he managed to drive how he did.
So seeing the picture of my nan, my great granny, who was my granny's mum, and just talking about her has made me remember so many things about my childhood. When I lived with my grandparents when we were little, me and my brother, and she was such an important part of our life. We used to wave Grandpa off to work, and then straight away Nan would get us together around the table. We'd spend the morning with her and we'd be playing cards. She taught us all these different games, Beat Your Neighbour, Rummy, games that I've gone on to teach my kids. She taught us how to tell the time. She got all her pennies out of the jar and we'd bet money when we were playing cards. She was amazing, and I only knew her in the 80s. I mean, if you think about it, she had a whole life before her, which she told us about, and I remember parts of it. And, other people could fill in the gaps, but, it would have been nice now to be able to ask her ourselves, get the first hand, what happened, just all things about the family. She was just lovely, kind, soft, squidgy old lady wearing a hairnet, and who was really important, gave us a structure in our lives, that we didn't have. So, it was lovely.
Earliest memory was visiting my mother's family out in the rural areas of west of Ireland when I was under not quite 4 years of age, I would think. And I remember standing by a 5-bar wooden gate into a field with my grandfather, who was a big old man and bald head. So that was one recollection. And on that same visit, I do remember catching a small chicken and putting it into a hole in the trunk of a big tree. Now, I'm not sure if the poor thing ever survived the experience, but that's my recollection. Climbing trees, collecting crab apples, and hazelnuts, and white strawberries. We didn't have many wild strawberries, but we did have them occasionally. And then fishing for trout and perch, and attempting to snare rabbits, and I only succeeded once. And we did spend quite a bit of time collecting mushrooms when they were to be collected. Now that was during the working day, but in the evening one listened to the radio, or one sometimes during the day listened to the radio, rugby union or cricket on the thing. And every evening, Dick Barton's Special Agent. It was his program on the BBC at 6:45 to 7:00.
Oh, my grandma, she was such a wonderful woman, so happy, full of life, always the centre of attention, centre of the party, looked so well put together. Actually, when I was younger, I was convinced she was the queen. She always had the matching shoes, bag, hat, dress, jacket. She just always looked immaculate. Born and bred a real northern lass, a pocket rocket at around 5'3" and definitely shrunk with age. A huge voice and tiny little lady. I'm sure, once she reached about 90 odd, I think she was about 5 foot, but she still kept that huge voice going. I remember travelling up to Bolton to see Grandma and Grandad every couple of months or so, and without fail, she used to open the door before we even got there, and she was holding just these delicious kind of homemade fairy cakes. God, they were perfect. A classic fairy cake bake, some icing, sweet gems. Actually travelling up, when we used to go and see them, me and my siblings, we actually used to try to avoid having any snacks on the journey. It was, the only time that we'd ever do that. It meant the mum and dad would let us have 3, sometimes 4 of her cakes. She was such a hoot. We used to play games with her. She taught us Twist, Rummy, 21s, and also Cheat. She was very good at Cheat. I think charming and sneaky are the key attributes of success in that game, and that she had plenty. She had such an eye for fashion and shopping, something I think her and I actually bonded over. We used to sneak off at family gatherings to go to the shops, and sometimes she'd buy me a really nice outfit. Even when she reached 90, she was still checking with me whether her coat, shoes and bags all went together. God, I'd wish we'd spent a bit more time just asking her questions.
Did you know that I was once a murder suspect in Japan? Yes, it was back in the early 90s. I was leaving my apartment, which was right above an izakaya, a Japanese bar, and the mama-san that ran it was out sweeping and getting ready for the evening. I smiled and waved. That evening, I found the entire block filled with police and learned that she had been murdered. The next morning, I was awoken by a pounding at the door, and I had a bright light in my face and a TV reporter asking questions. Later, after I took out my trash, I noticed that 2 guys dressed in white, not the regular trash guys, they were the ones taking away my trash, and they were going to go through it. I realized that perhaps I was a suspect. Yeah, the izakaya was annoying, and the Japanese men were drunk and singing every night. Maybe they thought I did it. Later, while at work teaching English, 2 Japanese detectives came by, and they wanted to talk to me. That got me nervous, I tell you. I asked for a Japanese friend to interpret, but she failed to show up. I was on my own with these guys. After 2 hours, they gave me relief, saying I wasn't a suspect, and they showed me a black and white photo of a raincoat that they had found at the scene. Have you seen this blue raincoat? One of them asked. How could I tell it was blue? No, I haven't seen that raincoat. They left, and later I learned they had caught the man, a jealous ex-lover, unhappy that she had found a new lover. But I missed that mama-san and her izakaya.
I was a regular visitor to Moscow in the 90s, delivering training programs. I met lots of people. One day, I was aware that I was being cultivated. One of my participants introduced me to her husband. Very quickly, he took me into his confidence and said the Soviet Union was imploding. Could I help him defect? I agreed. A few weeks later, having had some conversations on the telephone and written exchanges with the security services, I had a phone call. Could I meet them at the footbridge at the station? Sure, I said. I went there, no idea what would happen next. Suddenly someone brushes aside alongside me and says, "Follow me." I followed them up the stairs and across the bridge and down on the other side. Later I realised that was probably to check whether I was being followed or any security considerations. I followed the man up the high street. He slowed down. I was close to him. He turned, half turned, and said, "Inside the door, lady, brown coat." I went inside the pub, and yes, right inside the door there in the little lounge lobby, a very attractive Oxbridge kind of lady in a brown camel hair coat. She looked up at me, nodded, stood up, and walked back through the bar to where there was a terrace, a private terrace at the back of the pub. There we exchanged all the information. So sometimes when you read novels, the truth really is out there.
When I was 8 months pregnant with my fourth child, my husband and I went to Laurie's first swim lesson. She was 7 at the time. I was so big, and I was wearing my favorite muumuu right down to the ground. Bill and I sat up in the spectator stands at the back side of the pool with quite a balustrade in front of us. And then we watched the lesson. The teacher had the little children, they were all about 7, going across the pool and back again, and across the pool and back again. About the third time they did it, somebody touched Laurie and turned her so that instead of going across the pool, she went down to the deep end. Well, Mother stood on her feet immediately, and nobody seemed to notice her. I watched her go down and come up and go down. That was enough for me. I put myself over the balustrade and dove in the water and walked from the deep end with her held high over my head. You can imagine what I looked like when I came out with my big tummy and soaking wet.
When my sister and I were kids and we were told that Uncle Jack was coming to visit, we were so excited. We would sit there waiting for him. It didn't happen very often, maybe once or twice a year, Christmas or Boxing Day. He was always the last person to arrive, but when he arrived, 10 bob note would come out of his top pocket, one for me, one for my sister. He'd laugh, he'd tell us jokes, he'd play with us. Wonderful, handsome, athletic man. We were so sad when it was time for him to go. He was always the first person to leave. Very mysterious and very private, though. We didn't really know much about him, apart from those wonderful visits. I mean, I knew that he was a chemist and he worked at the patent office, and we knew that he was a swimmer. He swam every day for his entire life on Hampstead Heath and the men's ponds. Didn't matter what the weather was. We have this apocryphal family story of him on a bitter winter's day, surrounded by snow, breaking the ice so that he could get his daily swimming. But really, that's all we knew. And even though I spent more time with him in later life, when he was in his 80s, he didn't share any of his stories about his life And I suspect he probably had really amazing stories to tell. It's a shame. But he was a private man.
If I had a rough day, I could always go home and recover by listening to something that I liked. And in that context, I must bring in Mozart. Now, the piece I'm going to play you has got a very interesting history. It's no more and no less than the slow movement of the first symphony he ever wrote when he was 8 years old. He was over here as an infant prodigy, but his father, who was looking after him, was taken ill. Mozart was sitting with time on his hands, so he used it by writing this symphony. The interesting part about it is this, that many years later, in I think 1974, I was at the Salzburg Musical Festival, and the director of the Mozarteum, which is the Salzburg Conservatoire, which ran the festival, Bernard Paumgartner, had died the night before the festival started. Well, this, of course, had to be marked by a concert dedicated to him, and they played this slow movement of Mozart's First Symphony. And it was extraordinary to think that in dedication to a man over 80, we were playing music by a boy of 8, and yet it was dignified, appropriate, and just what was wanted. It was truly moving.